Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, we're going to learn secrets to calming an angry person of any age while remaining centered and calm. Boy, I think that would be something we would all like to be able to do, especially when it comes to expressing our ideas or at least sharing how we feel about things. How do you keep composure during a heated argument could be the question of the day, as well as the ability to withstand insults, provocations, and disrespect from others without losing our own cool. Living in a world today, especially with the political uncertainty, which is divided more than ever, our guest today will provide a simple, surefire way to communicate with others respectfully and productively, despite how tense the situation may be. He has more than 35 years as a conflict specialist, mediator, and peacemaker, specializing in difficult, complex, and intractable conflicts. He's also author of the award-winning book, Elusive Peace, How Modern Diplomatic Strategies Could Better Resolve World Conflicts. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, How to Calm an Angry Person in 90 Seconds or Less, Douglas Knoll. Douglas, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Good morning, Daniel. Thank you.
This is certainly an interesting line of work and a lifestyle that you found yourself in. When did this all start for you?
Well, my professional training is as a lawyer, and I was a hardcore trial lawyer for 22 years, and I started studying the martial arts in the 1980s, and eventually earned my second degree black belt. And my teacher told me that he thought it would be advisable for me to go learn Tai Chi because he thought I was too aggressive, too arrogant, and too dangerous.
Wow, that's a nice combination, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Trial lawyer and secondary black belt, not a good thing. So I started studying Tai Chi, and Tai Chi is the oldest of all martial arts, but it has two very interesting paradoxes. The first is the softer you are, the stronger you are. And the second is the more vulnerable you are, the more powerful you are. So soft to be strong, vulnerable to be powerful. Did not compute. But I persisted and eventually began to master Tai Chi and started to teach it. And somehow all of these two paradoxes soaked into me. So that one day in the mid-1990s, I was in a courtroom cross-examining somebody in my own inimitable aggressive style, and the thought came to me, what the heck am I doing in here? So after that trial, I had a long vacation scheduled, so I went off on a big Whitewater River trip up in Idaho and on the main salmon, and spent 10 days with friends just rafting down the river in my own raft, just pondering the question of how many people I'd really served as a trial lawyer. And at the end of the trip, I had pretty much determined that I hadn't served that many people. In other words, I'd done hundreds of trials, but how many people had really come out of the litigation process better than when they'd gone in? And it was just a handful. So I decided that maybe there was something else I should be doing rather than trying cases. And as it turns out, when I got back home and was driving out of the mountains, I live south of Yosemite in Central California, and my office at that time was in Fresno, California. I heard the one and only public service announcement for a new master's degree in peacemaking and conflict studies being offered at Fresno Pacific University, which is the West Coast Mennonite University. And the Mennonites, as many people know, are one of the three traditional Protestant peace churches. And I got interested. So I went down and talked to the people there, and ultimately I enrolled as a full-time master's degree student, and for the next 3 years, I was a graduate student, a law professor, and a trial lawyer. It was a pretty crazy time. But the people, my mentors, opened my eyes to what human conflict is really all about. And I realized that the law itself was deficient in many ways in how it looked at the totality of human conflict and what it takes to make peace. So that led me ultimately to leave the practice of law in 2000 and open up my mediation and peacemaking practice. And I've been doing that ever since. And my belief is that all peace and conflict originates inside our brains. And so as part of my master's studies, I began to study neuroscience, and I had the good fortune to come under the wings of John Allman, who's a neuroscientist at Caltech, and he started pointing me in the right direction and gave me some basic tutorials as a layperson on how to understand neuroscience from a lay perspective. And so I decided that everything that I taught, everything that I did had to have some basis in science. and it had to work, and it had to have some basis in science. So that's how it all started. And what was really interesting is that I had stumbled across in 2004 a technique, I guess you would call it, for de-escalating a couple that was having a horrible conflict. They'd spent $50,000 on attorney's fees in a case that was only about $18,000, and it was clearly not about the money. It was clearly about their relationship and their anger with each other. And I got them to calm down. And I couldn't figure out what the heck I'd done until 2007 when I read a scanning study by Matthew Lieberman, a neuroscientist at UCLA, who showed that when you pay attention to the emotions of another person and you label those emotions directly, it literally calms down the emotional centers of the brain and reactivates the prefrontal cortex so people can start thinking again and problem solving. And I read that study and I said, this is exactly what I did in 2004. And so I started developing techniques around this idea. And then in 2009, our Prison of Peace project started with my colleague Laurel Coffer and I, and we began training murderers to be peacemakers. And we started with 15 women in the largest, most violent women's prison in the world and trained them to be effective peacemakers, and it worked for them. They were able to take these skills and stop gang riots and stop murders and stop violence in prisons dead in its tracks, first time, every time, no failure.
Wow.
And so
now,
the prison
this wouldn't
project
happen to be the inspiration behind the hit television show Anger Management, would it?
Absolutely not.
Well, because you brought prison, and immediately I was thinking of Charlie Sheen,
right.
He working with prisoners. So.
Well, there's just So that's another interesting thing is the media, generally speaking, hates peace because peace is boring.
Well,
when you're doing a good job in peacemaking, it's pretty boring. So there's no real sexy stuff there.
It doesn't lead, exactly.
That's exactly right. So anyway, we were able to use the prison project, which is ongoing today in 10 California prisons and 3 prisons in Greece. And we were able to refine these techniques and teach inmates how to calm down potentially violent situations within the prisons, and we're actually able to teach inmates how to teach other inmates how to do this. So we've really refined these skills down to a point where they're very effective. And inmates had come up to me for years and said, if I had learned these skills 20 years ago, I wouldn't be in prison today. And my slow 50-watt dim baby boomer light bulb finally went on. I said, gee, there's a book here. So I wrote a book called De-Escalate, How to Calm an Angry Person in 90 Seconds or Less. And I'm now want to get the word out to everybody because we live, as you point out, in an extremely angry world today. And we have tools available to us to stop that if we wish. And the techniques are very simple, completely counterintuitive, but very, very simple when described. And so that's kind of how it all started. And that's kind of my mission today is to help people, if they choose, learn how to de-escalate angry people, whether it's a 2-year-old in the middle of a tantrum or an elderly parent who's grouchy and angry and upset because, they're in pain from age-related problems. It doesn't matter what it is, a coworker, a boss, a neighbor who's going off the cliff. Doesn't matter. The human brain responds to human conflict exactly the same way anywhere in the world, and all we have to know is what the tricks are to reverse that effect, and it works. It's
okay, well, Douglas, for our listeners out there, let's just say we got the 2-3-year-old throwing the tantrum. What then would be the next steps to be able to de-escalate?
So here, everybody take out a piece of paper and a pencil. 3 steps, really easy. There will be a quiz after this. I can't help myself. I'm a law professor. All right, step number 1. Doesn't matter what's going on, ignore the words. It doesn't matter whether you being directly and provocatively insulted by somebody or whether it's any other situation, you have to ignore the words because the words are not important right now. And for 90 seconds, everybody can ignore the words. And so it becomes critical because if you don't ignore the words, then what's going to happen is you're going to get triggered yourself. And once you get triggered, you get into the conflict, you get upset, and all of a sudden you can't be of any use to anybody. So ignore the words. Number 2, pay attention to the emotions of the speaker and guess at what those emotions might be. And it's usually pretty obvious. It's anger, frustration, anxiety, fear, grief. Boils down to about 9 different basic emotions is all you really need to worry about. But you guess at what they are. And again, it's guessing because you may or may not be right. As it turns out, it doesn't matter whether you're right or not, for the reasons I'll explain in a moment. And this gets us to the third step. And the third step is the one that's the counterintuitive step, and that is that you reflect back the emotional experience you think the speaker is having in that moment using a very simple you statement. You are angry. You're frustrated. You're feeling sad. You don't feel like you're being heard. You feel you're enraged right now. Whatever it might be, you simply reflect back the emotion. You don't use an I statement, such as what I think you're feeling is X, because once you use an I statement, you're on your track, not their track, and they will get mad. The second thing that you don't do is you don't ask a question. Are you angry? You would say you are angry. Now, if the speaker's now processing this, you're literally lending the speaker your prefrontal cortex, and this is why it's particularly powerful with 2- and 3-year-olds, because their brains are just now beginning to mature into their emotional centers, and they don't have the ability to express their emotions. They're just learning what it's all about. So when you express emotions for even a small child, the child can now begin to process that information and start figuring out what to do with it. And what Lieberman's study showed is when that happens, the emotional centers almost immediately start to quiet down, and the thinking part of the brain starts to come back online. And it's just amazing how it works. And it works every time, because that's how our brains are hardwired. So we ignore the words, guess at the emotions, reflect back the emotions with a very simple you statement. Mm-hmm. And you do that until you get a head nod and a verbal response saying, yeah, that's exactly what I feel. Mm-hmm. Then you're done.
Wow, that seems simple enough.
It is. Now, it's challenging. It's very simple, but and it's very elegant, but in teaching this to thousands of people, I've learned that there are challenges here. The first challenge is since our society does not give privilege to emotions, we are uncomfortable talking about emotions as a general rule. So it becomes very difficult for us to think about identifying another person's emotions and feeding them back. Second, it seems counterintuitive, self-obvious, and patronizing to tell somebody what they're feeling. But what we don't realize is they don't know what they're feeling. All they know is that they're just really mad, or they're really sad, or they're really glad, or whatever it might be. But we make an assumption that the speaker knows what he or she is feeling in the moment, when in fact they do not. They can't process that information, which is one of the reasons why they are extremely emotional in that moment. And by labeling the emotion for them, we give them the opportunity to process that information and calm down. So we have to overcome this idea of being patronizing. The third problem is that when you do these skills, you are calling out the emotions as they come up. So it seems like you're interrupting the speaker. And, of course, under normal conversational rules, that would be considered rude. But because you are focusing on the speaker from the speaker's frame of reference, the speaker does not feel like you're being rude. In fact, the speaker experiences a deep and empathic connection that he or she probably has never experienced before in her life. And I do this demonstration all the time in my classes and workshops. And so after I do the first demonstration, I say, well, what did you all see? And invariably somebody will raise a hand and say, well, that was the rudest, most disrespectful, patronizing, manipulative thing I've ever seen anybody do. How can you expect us to do that? And then I turn to the speaker and say, well, what was your experience? And usually the speaker will turn to me and say, that was the most profound experience I've ever had in my life. Nobody has ever listened to me like that. And everybody else is just looking there with their jaw dropping, saying, how can that be? You were just so rude. And I point out, this is listening. It's not conversation. Listening has its own set of rules. When we engage in conversation, it's almost always about me or I. But when we're listening, it's all about you. Right. And as long as it's all about you, we can label the emotions as often as they come up, oftentimes saying more words than the speaker is saying, because we're seeing emotions that the speaker doesn't even know that he or she is experiencing. Mm-hmm. And I tell people, I say, hey, don't take it from the great Doug Noll. Go out and try it yourself. I mean, never, ever take my word for it. Go out and experiment. Try this out on people and see what happens, and see whether or not people tell you if you're rude or not. And you will find that they won't. You will find that they'll say, thank you for listening to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see that, too, especially when you pause and you just stay quiet and kind of allow something to course itself. I think too often when an argument tends to occur, most of the time it's two sides trying to be right about something.
That's exactly right.
And it's hard to be right about something when you're not really feeling very rational in the moment about whatever that is.
That's right. And so that brings up a very important rule, which is, when do you listen? You listen when you're able to listen. So you're willing to listen and you're able to listen. If you're highly escalated yourself, you may not be able to listen because you have a need to be validated and vindicated in that moment. And that means that you need to be listened to. In order for you to be listened to, you have to listen first. That's pretty much what we call it, earning your turn. Now, it may be the person that you're speaking to doesn't have these skills, and so you may not get listened to in a deep way. But at least if you can de-escalate them, you can create peace around you and maybe teach the other person, coach them into listening to you in the way that you need to be listened to. But you have to listen first before you do anything else.
Now, let's talk about mediation. Is this something that you also use within this as well?
Absolutely. When I'm mediating, this is a skill. This is my go-to skill, because people will not come to me and pay my fee unless they have a very serious problem and emotions are running very high. And so when they come to me, they are needing help in solving a problem and restoring some equanimity between people that they can't do it themselves. They simply don't have the skills. So when I meet in conference with people in mediation, almost always I am de-escalating the parties. If they're represented by lawyers in a litigated case, I'm de-escalating the lawyers because the lawyers are pretty emotional and angry. And I spend a good part of my time getting people calmed down. And what I've learned is that if I can get people calmed down sufficiently, they'll figure out how to solve the problem themselves. And so my job is mostly de-escalating and then problem-solving and helping people avoid bad decision-making. I'm going to let them make the decisions. I'm going to guide them through their decision-making process so they make the best decision they have in front of them. And sometimes that means it's picking the least worst of what their choices are, which is never very happy. But sometimes that's the way it is. But having them avoid making decisions that are not optimal for them by keeping them calmed down and focused on the problem-solving process. And they make their decisions. And whether or not they decide to resolve the conflict or continue it or do something else is totally up to them. That's why I consider myself a decision architect. I'm helping them build I'm helping them build towards a decision in a way that's going to give them a firm foundation. And the first step is de-escalation. So that's what mediation fundamentally is all about. And a good mediator will know how to de-escalate and then how to guide people into a problem-solving process. And then, of course, once you get into the problem-solving process, oftentimes people will re-escalate. Something will trigger them, and they'll get angry and upset. And you just de-escalate them right then and there, calm them down, and get them back on the path. And you iterate this process over and over again throughout the process. I might de-escalate 10, 15 times a day in a process.
You know, and it's looking at this too. It's another way of looking at it is try to be as much of a solution to what seems to be a problem than the problem itself. And what I mean by that is, for instance, anybody who has, let's say, a YouTube channel, you tend to have people that'll go on there and they'll comment on whatever it is you produce. And a lot of times you'll have people that may come on there and they like to call them trolls, or just like to get on there and just spew out junk is basically what they do. And I have those situations, and usually one of two ways I handle. One is I just don't bother with it at all. I just delete it. If it doesn't have anything to do with what I'm talking about here, then there's no reason for that to be on there. And they usually go away if they know they're not getting your goat. But on the other hand, let's say that they are, and I've actually seen this in a thread here and there from time to time, where somebody will just come at you with this information, contradicting everything it is that maybe you put out there. And you simply go, well, this is pretty interesting that you have this here. Where did you come about this particular information? How do you know that what you're sharing with me is true? And I'm really kind of digging this out from them. And then in the end, if they're really just, chipping away at trying to be sure that their point of view is solid, then I usually will say something like, I see that you spend a lot of time and energy thinking about this. Why don't you see what you can come up with as a solution to what I'm presenting here? And typically, I never hear from them again.
Of course, and of course, and I do the same thing. I mean, I've got a large YouTube channel and with a lot of subscribers, and I will get those snarky comments. And my process is exactly the same as yours. I'll look at the comment and decide, is this relevant or not? Is this useful in a conversation for all my subscribers to look at, or is this just some person who's being an idiot? So if they're not being an idiot, but they are being critical, or they're the first thing I'll do is I'll de-escalate. I'll say, you are really frustrated. You feel deeply offended. You feel whatever emotion I'm reading into the comment, I will immediately affect label it in the comment. And I'll wait and see if I get a reply. And if I get a reply, again, depending on the response, then I'll start moving into the problem-solving mode in pretty much the same way you do. I'll say, all right, I'd be really interested in seeing what science you have to support your position. If you've got some, I'd be really interested in studying it and trying to understand better what you're saying and what I'm presenting, and finding out if I can learn something from this. And typically, they go away.
Right. I know I had one particular instance that comes to mind is where a guy was talking about a website that discredits doctors, I guess. And, was just going on and on about all, what kind of, and my first question is, what credibility does this website have? I mean, the Internet's basically the bathroom wall of the world when you think about it. And so this guy's just going on and just throwing all these links at me and just really promoting heavily this website. I'm thinking to myself, well, is he somebody who contributes to it, or what's going on here? But that being said, I said, why don't you spend more time helping people find solutions to what we're talking about here, instead of promoting some website that debunks the doctors that we're talking to here in the first place.
Well, that's really interesting.
What it's about, that sort of thing.
That's right, and that's a really interesting observation, because it's much, much easier for people to criticize and say what's wrong than it is for them to use their creative imagination and figure out solutions. Finding solutions to problems requires a set of skills that many people just have not developed.
Right.
It requires critical thinking, it requires imagination, it requires the ability to research, it requires the discipline to go through a linear process to come up with alternative solutions and then evaluate those solutions. These are skills that are required for effective problem solving that have, I think, a lot of people have never developed because they haven't been taught these skills in their primary and secondary and college education, and so they don't have the ability to do that. And it takes effort. It's effortful. So people are much happier just being critical than they are being problem solvers. And so what happens is when somebody's being critical and criticizes a position or a belief, and the person who's postulating the belief, of course, immediately gets triggered and gets defensive, and now we're in the escalation cycle. As opposed to stopping and pausing for a second, thinking, okay, what's going on here? I mean, I talk a lot about how to have a calm conversation with the politically polarized, because obviously that's an issue today.
Right.
And what I tell people is never ever challenge the beliefs of another person. Don't try to persuade them. Don't try to argue with them. Don't try to present them with facts that show what idiots they are. Don't do that, because the research shows us that when somebody has a strongly held belief and you confront them with facts that are inconsistent with their belief, they will hold on to the belief, and dopamine will be released in their brains to reinforce that belief structure even deeper. So all you're doing when you're presenting people with facts that are true but inconsistent with the belief is you're just making the belief more stubbornly embedded in the brain.
Right. I'll tell you a funny example of that is we were at a trade event from time to time, and this particular one was, I believe it was a diabetes expo. And so I was talking with somebody at the booth, and behind me I could actually hear my wife in this, I wouldn't call it a heated discussion, but certainly an animated one with somebody else. And so I got done with the person I was talking with, and I turned around to see what was going on here. And my wife says to me, this man here doesn't believe that you can reverse the symptoms of diabetes. And I watched him, and his body braced. He was ready for an argument. Uh-huh. And that's what was funny. I could just see it in his body language.
That's right.
And here's all I said. Well, okay. So what? If he believes that she can't do it, and then the guy's body language just deflates like, damn, you mean I don't get to argue with this guy? I'm like, why would I challenge your belief?
Now, supposing that you had to engage that person, so what I might say is I might sit down with this guy over a cup of coffee, and I might say, so tell me about all the life experiences
right.
that have led you to the conclusion that diabetes can't be affected by diet or can't be changed. Tell me what in your life has led you to that. And then I'd see now the person would start to become autobiographical, and that's going to open up a whole bunch of information about why this person believes the way they do. And then if they're willing to listen to how you came about your beliefs, and they can listen to your autobiography around this belief, all of a sudden people find that they have far more common ground than they could possibly believe.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
And it calms people down, and we no longer have these huge arguments over these pressing policy issues or social issues that superficially are driving us apart. But if we really took the time to just to sit down and listen a little bit, we would find that we have a lot of commonality. I mean, a story that was told to me by a close colleague was when, I don't know, maybe 15, 20 years ago, you'll probably recall there were these radical people going around blowing up abortion clinics around the country. And the word got out to Boston that they were coming to Boston. And so my colleague pulled together the pro-life and pro-choice people, women, got them in a room and started working with them. And they all went around and told their stories, their life stories. And at the end he said, what is the one value that you all agree on? And they looked at him dumbfounded because they thought they were just completely polarized. And he said, you all agree on the sanctity of life. Every single one of you believes in the sanctity of life. You might disagree when that life has to be protected, but you all agree on the sanctity of life. So thinking about that, what is your response to the threat of these radicals coming into Boston? And they sat there and they talked about it for a few minutes. They all just unanimously decided, we don't want any part of that. And the word went out, don't come to Boston.
Right. Wow.
I mean, that's the power of this sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm. So tell us, Douglas, where is there a website where people can find out more about how to get your book and and good reading, things like that?
Absolutely. The book is almost ready to be released. I just actually got my copies from the publisher 2 days ago, so it should be hitting all the bookstores and Amazon and Barnes & Noble and all the usual sites in the next couple of days. But due to a philanthropist who really wants my work to get out there, we were able to offer the book for free plus shipping. If they go to DougNoll.com, DougNoll.com, and when you hit the landing page, there's a banner there. Just click on the banner. It'll take you to the sales page. Pay $7 for shipping, and you'll get on the list. And as soon as the book is ready to be shipped, which should be in the next week or so, it'll be in your hands. And the book is takes you through the trajectory of life. The first 3 chapters sort of introduce the concepts and the science behind the concepts, and then we start talking with how to deal with small children, how to deal with preteens, how to deal with teenagers, how to deal with relationships, how to deal with coworkers. What do we do in schools, that sort of thing, with teachers and administrators and that sort of thing. And then finally, I spend some time talking about the politically polarized and how do we go about listening to the politically polarized. So I try to take these basic skills and I add more ideas and skills in around problem solving and give people a guidepost, very simple how to do it. This is how you do it. Practice guide, so that when they encounter upsetting situations, instead of getting reactive and becoming emotional themselves, they can listen appropriately, reflect appropriately, and calm the situation down. And it's so powerful. I mean, it is unbelievably powerful how it works.
Very good. I can see how it would, and certainly that people are going to be able to learn from this and actually grow as well. Douglas, thank you so much for being on the program today. For our listeners, go ahead and give out that website one more time.
Mm-hmm. The website is DougNoll, DougNoll.com. Thank you so much, Daniel.
You bet. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Okay,
We want to thank you, the
day.
listeners out there, for tuning in. You can also discover more. Visit us at Beyond50Radio.com. That is the number 50. We do encourage you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter so you can keep up to date with what's going on in the world of Beyond 50 as well as our upcoming shows. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for joining us. This is the Beyond 50 Radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.